All Canadians would agree that Canada is at a historic crossroads. Where are we going to go in terms of, well, a lot of choices, a lot of policy choices that we face in this country as a imminent election is around the corner. We have a new prime minister and we have a lot of very important choices to make. That's what we're going to talk about today with our next guest. So with me here today to talk about these important choices is, of course, our friend, the Honourable Dan McTeague. He is a former Liberal Party member and MP and certainly served in many different capacities in this country. He's also the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. So a warm welcome, Dan McTeague.
David, great to be here, my friend, and looking forward to this wonderful discussion.
Well, Dan, it's great to have you because I know that you bring a lot of depth and background to the issues that we're going to talk about as we get kind of a temperature read on a lot of the things that are happening here. And there's a lot of issues that we need to talk about. One of which is, well, first of all, we have a new prime minister, Mark Carney. And who is Mark Carney? Like, what policies does he really stand for, in your opinion?
Well, he's always been sort of on the monetary side of things. Government tends to be on the fiscal side of things. And for the past 30, 40 years, at least since the firing of a guy named James Coyne back in 1961, yes, that'll be Andrew Coyne's father, Deborah Coyne's father.
Oh, yes.
We've always sort of said to ourselves, we have to keep a firewall between what governments do in terms of economic policy and what the Bank of Canada does in terms of economic policy. It's called the fiscal and the monetary divide, and the two have to be in sync. We learned that in the 1980s and 1990s, and we were able to get the country back on its financial feet again. But he comes from the monetary side, so not just in Canada, but of course in the United States, rather in England, and of course his work with a number of companies, hedge funds, etc., dealing with assets management. Of course, he's better known for his rubbing shoulders with the great climate leaders around the world, the ones pushing carbon taxes and, of course, net zero. So that's where Mark Carney comes from. That's where he hails from. Very different, no political experience whatsoever at a time in which the country could probably use a little bit more. Although some would say, hey, we need business experience too. That didn't work so well for those who accused Jean Chrétien of having no business experience. He had plenty of political experience at the time, and the country needed him. So I think this will bode very well, not for Mr. Carney, but for Mr. Poilievre.
Okay, that's very interesting. So we have a new prime minister who you'd say has minimal political experience. He did win the leadership, though, of the Liberal Party, and you know that party very well. I mean, you were a Liberal MP for years. So what happened in the Liberal race? Like, obviously, it's in the interest of all Canadians to have healthy, vibrant political parties. What happened during the last Liberal leadership campaign where Mark Carney became the leader?
Well, there really wasn't a campaign. It was a coronation. And it's pretty clear that he was the heir apparent for some time. Trudeau had made him his economic advisor since 2020. And of course, the past 5 years has seen a remarkable deterioration in our economic fortunes. I'm not sure if that's because of him, but there's no doubt the timing of his move towards that position given by Trudeau coincided with some pretty tough times. However, his win at the leadership had less than half of the people who had signed up showing up to vote, and there really wasn't much of a debate. I've seen those debates. I mean, I remember the one between Dion and Ignatieff and Gerard Kennedy, and all of these ones over the past years in 2006, and again in one in 1990 with Jean Chrétien versus Paul Martin. And I remember the one with John Turner versus Jean Chrétien, and they were big divides, policy differences, which the party, of course, came together afterwards. But we didn't see that here. In fact, it was just sort of more of the same thin gruel that the Canadians are really frustrated with. And so while some may say, hey, that's great, we had a great open, transparent position, there are two problems for Canadians. One, there was no debate. Second of all, it was a coronation. Third, maybe even we can include the fact that, hey, he's prime minister acting on behalf of the country without a parliamentary mandate, without an electoral mandate.
Well, so help us understand, because the past history, as you say, is usually in these kinds of contests, you'd have pretty vigorous debate around, well, big choices around policy and vision, but that didn't seem to happen. And you even used the word coronation. So help us understand what the heck happened. Like, why would there be such a coronation when in fact you'd think there'd be, after 10 years of of a Liberal leader in charge, namely the Prime Minister Trudeau, that there would actually be a vigorous debate, especially given, the unpopularity of the outgoing Prime Minister.
Well, they were inextricably linked, and they had been for several years. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, except that the new boss actually ran the economic levers from behind the scenes behind
Okay.
Trudeau. So I think that's why there really wasn't. This is continuity. This is not a change. And though some Canadians are fooled into believing, hey, it's a new name, and oh, he's got
Hmm.
a business acumen, and he did stuff in England and here. I mean, the
Hmm.
record shows otherwise. Especially when he's come out and made some statements that I think many people find a little puzzling, if not frankly dishonest, because they are claims that he can't possibly make without a proper understanding of the context, including 1998 balancing the budget when that was Paul Martin. He wasn't even in Canada.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so if I had to use the kind of the old metaphor, it's kind of like Mark Carney in many ways has been a very important policy advisor, the power behind the throne, and now he's actually on the throne. Is that another
Yeah.
way to look at this?
And the land, of course, is run down. The land is depleted. The
Mm.
land is not strong, and of
Mhm.
course, one can easily say, "Hey, you can't claim on the one hand you've done all these things when things went well, and then divorce yourself from what you have been for the past 5 years as it relates to Canada, if in fact you even lived in Canada." And I won't get down to disparaging the fellow. It's just that I take him at
Yeah.
his word, and everything I've seen from that man so far is easily challengeable, not just in terms of
Mhm.
the record and those who write a lot about these things. I was there, so I know exactly what
Mhm.
happened. He wasn't there in 1998. He certainly didn't help the economic decline that the world saw in 2008. That was because of David Dodge, his predecessor,
Yeah. Right.
Bank of Canada governor, and Paul Martin, who basically insulated our mortgage system, our financial system, to inoculate us from those
Mhm.
who had made some pretty bad investments, especially south of the border.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So you would say that from your observation that what we have here under a Carney government, and we'll have to wait and see how different policy pronouncements come out, will essentially be like the Trudeau government or keeping with that kind of policy history and background. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, these are all members of Parliament, ministers who served under Trudeau. There's no difference. And although he can't go back to the House because he knows next Monday or Tuesday he'll face a confidence vote, whether Jagmeet prevaricates and decides to vary his position as he's done, what, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. The reality is, I think he doesn't have a hope in hell of staying in power because he doesn't have the public's approval to do what he's doing. So he's very limited in what he can do, what he can say. And what he's saying so far, I think, is leading many to the conclusion that he's not, he doesn't have the royal jelly. If we're talking
Oh,
coronation, and I think
okay.
for a lot of people, wait for the debate.
Okay, so the new prime minister has inherited obviously a situation including both policy prescriptions for the state of the economy and how we move things forward in our country. I guess one of the questions that is an obvious one, and certainly you've spoken about this many times, is the whole issue of carbon taxes. And I think for a lot of Canadians, it's a little bit confusing because it's been announced by the new prime minister that they're getting rid of the retail carbon tax. So is that a significant 180, a significant change in policy that is a good one?
Well, they know it's in a very aggressive approach to their net zero policies. They've been standing by this carbon tax since 2017, and they accelerated it again in 2019, right after the federal election, where they said, "Hey, we'll only make it go so high." They called it, emissions per ton. They said they would stop it at $80 a ton,
Mhm.
but in fact increased it, ratcheted it up more than double to $170 a ton by 2030. So every year that price has gone up and it's made it extraordinarily unpopular. What they're proposing right now is nothing short of a sham because they're basically going to do it for the election period so that people are not concerned about that. They'll see an 18 to 20 cent drop depending where you are in Canada, except for Quebec. We don't know about BC yet, whether EB will go along with it or not. But at the end of the day, I expect it to be completely reapplied because the framework legislation, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Pricing Act, is still in place, hasn't been amended. All they have to do is basically by stroke, literally a stroke of a pen, or in this case, I guess it was a Sharpie, just reapply it, call it an industrial carbon tax. You'll pay for it either way because
No
companies that
kidding.
have to pay that tax have to pass it on.
Okay, so it's look, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Dan, but it's kind of a head fake then because They're getting rid of the retail carbon tax, which is incredibly unpopular with Canadians. I mean, that's obviously why the Conservatives adopted a policy advocating getting rid of it. But this is just putting your, are you saying that the carbon tax would just appear at the industrial level? And doesn't it impact Canadians in the same way? Because all those costs have to be passed on to you, the consumer. So it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah, it's the same thing. The thing is, you won't see it. You won't get a rebate, as they do in many provinces across the country,
Yeah.
except for BC and Quebec.
Hmm.
But it may be a little bit less, but not a whole lot less. The objective is still there. And Carney made that very clear in travel to Europe. Hey, buy Canadian goods because we have a carbon tax, because we have a net zero policy. So, he can't say to one thing to the European audience, of which he says we are European light,
Hmm.
whatever that should be,
Hmm.
and then come back home and say, oh, no, I got rid of it. He asked him the question, and he honestly cannot answer that. After the election, should you form government, Mr. Carney, will you reimpose those taxes in one form or
Ah,
another that will affect consumers? That question has been asked. He refused to answer it. And I think I know why, because they did the same thing in 2019 when the question said, what are you going to do about the cap on per tonnage? And they said
oh,
they would
yes.
remain at
Yeah.
80. They lied. They broke their promise. They went to 170. And apparently in 2021, Canadians were okay with that up until they wound up having to pay more for fuel, heating, and food.
Okay, so this has a big impact on Canadians. So I think that's a very important question that you're asking, is that if elected, would that policy really continue as a carbon tax on you as Canadians? So related to this whole question then, Dan, is, the Trudeau government has pursued a vigorous war on Canadian oil and gas all these years. I mean, it's really quite stunning, the impacts that's had on the industry. So my question is, would you see or anticipate a Carney government continuing with that war on Canadian oil and gas?
Well, Mr. Carney isn't just one who has tried to divest from oil and gas and the mechanisms by which we get oil and gas to the rest of the world, not just Canada, but the United States, with his so called chairmanship of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. His own company has invested mightily in pipelines in Brazil, in the United Arab Emirates. Of course, his company's now packed up and left shop in Canada, out of Toronto, now in New York. I
Mhm.
digress. I mean, the reality is that if he is a fundamental follower of net zero and he's part of the World Economic Forum, he is very much in favor of ensuring Canada does not provide or does not get an opportunity to produce oil or natural gas and deliver it to the rest of the world. Even though we've had projects for the past 17, 18 years that have a number of these projects that were on the paper. We have all
Mhm.
the natural gas, a lot more in the United States, by the way. But the United States built the LNG projects. We sell them natural gas for $3. They in turn sell it to Europeans and to the rest of the world for 15. We are
Wow.
suckers because we follow this ideology that Mark Carney and his followers, like Stephen Guilbeault and others, have
Mhm.
implemented. Hurt Canada.
Okay, so this is part of the story that is, I think, frankly, if more Canadians knew, they would be scratching their heads altogether. Why would we pursue this war on our own energy sector when, in fact, all kinds of countries around the world are pursuing energy aggressively? Like, we all know that in order to build a prosperous country, energy is foundational. That is like the ace card that you have: clean, affordable energy.
Yeah.
So why are we not pursuing that kind of policy framework? It seems to me like it's almost inflicting pain on ourselves. It's almost like a suicide type of policy.
Well, we could do these things in 2015 because it was 2015. The economy was good.
Mm.
The finances of the country were strong. We were able to do a whole lot. But these days, we can't do those things simply because we now know full well the government has basically turned around and decided that it's going to turn its back on the very things, the most lucrative industry in this country, cut it back, shorten it, and as a result, make things that much more difficult for Canadians. And I think that's one of the reasons why the narrative and the teaching
Mm.
and the belief that this is somehow bad has been
Yeah.
a false ideology perpetrated and targeting our young people in their schools to believe that somehow Canada is bad and that we
Mhm.
can magically wave a magic wand, have carbon taxes, and bring down or change the global weather systems.
Yeah. So, gosh, it's really kind of uh, unbelievable that a nation as rich as Canada can't seem to get its act together on energy policy. And we could actually help the world. We know that all kinds of nations have been knocking on our door collectively, seeking energy. And I know that there was an energy deal's inked between Alberta with Premier Daniel Smith and I think an energy consortium out of Japan. So that looks very encouraging. But we could be signing what dozens of those with the world all over. Wouldn't that make a positive difference?
Well, when you think of $130 billion is what the current energy arrangement is for Canada selling to the rest of the world versus the automotive, which is 80 billion, you kind of know that you're where your priorities lie. And the
Mhm.
golden goose for Canada is energy. And when you saw Japan ink a $1 trillion deal over 10 years with the United States on LNG, which we decided wasn't important, you kind of say, well, why did we have that missed opportunity? And that missed opportunity had a lot to do with our deliberate policy of saying there's no business case. Nothing could be further from the truth. The business case argument was one, of course, that was advocated by Justin Trudeau, but his economic advisor, Mark Carney, was very much behind that. It's all about shutting down and ensuring that our energy sector doesn't perform and we allow other nations to beat us at our own punch,
Mhm.
especially our neighbors to the south who have less energy than we do.
Yeah, no, it's kind of unbelievable. So help us, Dan, if we look at the geopolitical situation, including our relationship with the United States now, because I know that you were the parliamentary secretary in foreign affairs at one point. Help us understand how we should be managing our relationship with the US now. We know that the US, under the Trump administration, has been very direct about its concerns regarding border security, that we've got a lot of bad actors in this country laundering their money, trafficking drugs, the whole concern regarding that Canada's a NATO laggard. We don't carry our contractual obligation of 2% of GDP. And there's also a lot of missives around, there being a trade imbalance. So what's your take on this, Dan? What should we be doing as a nation to actually, well, frankly, manage this relationship with our neighbor, but also get Canada to be a prosperous nation?
Well, I think engagement is important, and the provinces are doing that. Nice to see Ontario and a few others finally taking a more peaceful, democratic, and of course, diplomatic approach. Very much like I think Danielle Smith has set the right tone very early on. She was playing chess when the rest of these premiers and Justin Trudeau were playing checkers. And
Mhm.
that's not the way you handle a guy like Trump, who, in my experience, and I worked with Gas Buddy for quite a few years during Trump's first administration, he'd make a tweet or put something on what
Mhm.
was not then called X, and markets would jump and people would be up in the air about prices dropping or going up based on what he said. That was true the first year, 2016, 2017. By 2018, 2019, we were starting to ignore it and say, listen, he has an issue. We'll address it. We'll address it in our own time. If he wants to put tariffs on, he knows it's going to hurt his country as much as it's going to hurt the other countries. News that, of course, he's going to put tariffs on everybody means that he's got a more serious problem. The question is, how do we get out of it first? And we do that
Mhm.
by reasoning with his advisors as well as state, especially Republican states, to say, your interest is our interest, and your number one trading partner isn't China, it's not Europe, it's actually Canada. So what's good for Canada is good for you, and vice versa. And I think that's starting to sink through. We're seeing less and less of the rhetoric, certainly in the past couple of weeks.
Okay, so let's be careful not to overreact to the
Right.
misses of Donald Trump,
Yeah.
but let's also keep in mind that it's in our interest to be smart about how we work with, well, our largest trading partner. Yeah, let's diversify trade and help me understand, Dan, because you've seen this within our federal system. Why don't we have free trade across Canada? Like this is insane because we're losing out on, well, depending on the calculation, 3-4% of our GDP. I mean, that should be money in the bag for
Well,
every Canadian. That means thousands of dollars for every Canadian, doesn't it, Dan? Why don't we have
yeah.
that?
It's hard to say why we have these tariffs. It's almost like we have these old little mini states that operate in a way
Yeah.
that is in contrary to each other's interests. And I think, look, we may get mad at Donald Trump in terms of what he's done, but one thing he's certainly done is he's exposed our weaknesses in
Yeah.
pipelines. Now we
Yes.
believe at least a natural gas pipeline should be built. He's exposed our weakness in terms of electric vehicles, that we've wasted all this money on EVs, and he destroyed the mandate. So we better get back to internal combustion engines very quickly, done very efficiently. He's demonstrated that we need to build more pipelines, of course, from coast to coast, not just natural gas, but oil.
Mhm.
And the irony, of course, is that he's made it so that Canadians now realize that once and for all, we need to get our own trade relationship and better our trade relationship with other nations. So, and at the same time, wear the Canadian flag, elbows up,
Yeah,
whatever
I
that
know.
means.
Elbows up.
I mean, look, what does it take? Up to this point, we were disrespecting the country. We were disrespecting its traditions. We were pouring paint on statues. We were taking names off streets.
Yes.
This wasn't the Canadian way.
Yeah.
Yeah, what does it take? Donald Trump to make us realize what a great nation we are? My God, do Canadians
Yeah.
have a woke ideology that prevents them from understanding Canada?
Right.
That's the case. We got a problem with Canadians. Thank goodness they've waken up now.
No, it is truly a fascinating case study as you see this emotion. And look, we're both very patriotic Canadians, but it's almost farcical because you look at the past history of denigrating our country
Yeah,
from, the traditions that you cited is a really powerful summation. I looked at my wife's old passport and my new passport, and I was stunned by the difference, like just stripping out every historical reference. They took out Terry Fox and Agnes MacPhail, and it's like there's stick people. Yeah, that's it. Is that the new one?
that's the
Or is that the old
Charlottetown,
one?
that 1864.
Yeah,
That's the
there it
old
is.
one.
Yeah,
The old one.
the wonderful picture of Confederation, and they stripped that out. I mean, it's embarrassing. I actually had. I don't want to sound too like I'm an emotional dish rag, but I actually had a tear in my eye. I said, like, this is crazy because
Yeah,
you are destroying the
yeah,
story, the identity of our nation.
yeah.
And you're leaving ourselves with somebody raking their grass and there's a squirrel with a nut. Like, it's just so disrespectful, I think, about
Yeah,
our
okay.
country. So we've got some serious work to do, I think, not only on policy, but rebuilding, well, and teaching that story and identity, right, Dan, in terms of the next generation, let alone the
You,
current one.
it wasn't that long ago. This is 10 years ago. This thing expires in 2026. I just used it last week when I had to head down to Texas to warn Americans that they need Canadian oil and gas. And here I am. I go to the last spike. I mean, why are we teaching our kids about these things? These are vignettes people don't understand because
Yeah.
we've abandoned our sense of history. And I challenge every teacher in this country to stop the
Yes.
agenda that basically focuses on things that forget and denigrate the nation. And so I'm sure they don't mean it, but my
Yeah.
God, we've fallen as a country. And if we don't have any respect for ourselves, don't get the Donald Trumps of this world to call you on it.
Yeah. No, I think we're onto something because, I was always taught that culture matters. The way we treat each other on a day-to-day basis and those traditions and things like even the flag, the use of the flag is a very important symbol that unites us. And I think that's a beautiful vision and reminder of the vision of our founders who said, you know what, you can come from anywhere in the world, but you can show up here. And as long as you buy into that kind of, well, common set of foundational unity and values as a Canadian, we can work together to build this country, this place where we live. And I think that's a wonderful vision. And it's almost like we've forgotten that, or in this case, as we've talked about, have been deliberately undermining it. So, yeah, I think it's very important. The culture, our identity, our traditions matter in this country, don't they, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. And without them, we find their country at a loss. How ill-equipped we are to face the challenges of those who are certain of their nation, have a firm rooted understanding of nation building. But anybody who believes that we are a post-national state might have
Yeah,
believed that up until a couple of weeks ago. But the crisis that's before us now requires that we get back very quickly to the basics and understand a little bit more about ourselves. That despite very challenging times and a
mhm,
very inhospitable environment and major wars and other conflicts, Canada has emerged punching well above its weight. We need to get back to those days, and we need to do that.
exactly.
We are.
Well, it almost seems, Dan, that in retrospect, we made some, maybe it was well intended or maybe it was cynical politics, I'm not sure, but we made strategic errors on the whole issue of culture and identity. Did we take multiculturalism too far in the sense that we kind of lost the plot? Like, we've got to, so we can celebrate people's stories and individually and where they come from and their culture. But at the same time, we've got to do the job number one is to build up our unifying values. Did we go too far in multiculturalism?
If you have no respect for yourself, don't expect others to have it for you. And even
That's
those
it.
who come to this country who have said, we love this country. Why are you denigrating yourself? Why are you disparaging yourself? Why are you taking a knee? And I say these things now because in hindsight, in the next 5-10 years, if not now, these things will be seen as objectionable tokens of our willingness to forget and abandon who we are. And again, other people are picking us apart, saying, your country doesn't believe in itself. Why should we believe in you?
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe during this time of challenge, that can be a positive way to frankly bring clarity to these kinds of questions so that we can rebuild our country in so many ways. And speaking of rebuilding our country, I guess the question I have for you, Dan, is so many Canadians see ourselves in kind of a national crisis. I mean, I was just getting my insurance renewed, and the person that I was dealing with said she's never heard from so many people as they see insurance rates go up, so many people that are understandably anxious about their future. So during this time of national crisis and tension, Parliament is not at work. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever, does it, Dan?
No, and prior to that prorogation, it had stalled. We know that prorogation
Yeah.
happened because Trudeau knew his own caucus finally, after 9 years, had the intestinal fortitude to smarten up and reflect the concerns that Canadians were screaming at them. The Liberals stood a chance of being reduced to 10 seats, a rump in the House of Commons without even party status.
Yes.
So that came on top of 3 months of the federal Liberals ignoring an order of the Speaker of the House of Commons saying no business can be conducted other than the question period until you guys surrender the documents surrounding the scandalous misuse of public money on the Green Slush Fund. A lot of Canadians want to forget that. That's their damn money. We're talking $400 million. That's
Yes.
$1,000 per Canadian. You just gave away to a bunch of people who potentially misuse that, and it's going to come right back in this election, like it or not.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a key story I think that we've forgotten, is that there were many reasons to prorogue that Parliament. One of which is we had a party, the Liberal Party, that wanted to have a leadership race, so they wanted to, put a pause on Parliament. But there was another reason as well, Dan, that you're getting at, and there are these accounts, and there's the nickname of it is called the Green Slush Funds. Can you explain what that is and what that was about? Because it is really remarkable that the Speaker of the House of Commons was demanding these documents, because ultimately everybody, including the government, is responsible to the House, and they were providing these documents.
Yeah.
So help us understand what happened there.
An order of the House is basically a parliamentarian can demand of any department an accountability of the amount they've expended. In the case of STDC, the Sustainable Technology Development credits, they demanded, after months of investigation, that Parliament provide who received what money out of that fund and who benefited from that. The concern was that the people who were administering the STDC were the same people benefiting from it, voting to divert money to their own companies and corporations. So that created a real specter of conflict of interest. That's why when the Speaker saw this, he ruled. He said, "No, you have no choice. Parliament is supreme. The House of Commons is supreme.
Indeed, yes.
We cut off a king's head back in the 1600s because he was going to take over the British, the mother of all parliaments. So the bottom line is that Parliament hasn't functioned since September. Our House of Commons hasn't worked since September, and we have a crisis after crisis, which Canadians are saying, it can be resolved by somebody with a business experience. Look, I think if people understand the history and they still want to ignore it, what they really need to do is give their little woke heads a shake, because the reality is I've never seen something this bad. It makes a mockery, not just of Canada, but of our democracy, because our democracy is broken, like it or not.
Okay, so wow. So our democracy is broken in the sense that this is an example where we have a House of Commons. We've got 1,000-year history of transparency, or there's supposed to be accountability and an honorable tradition for every government to be held to account. And yet this has been put aside now. And that's the legacy of this government right now.
It is. Yeah, very much. I mean, I don't have to go back to Runnymede 1215.
Yes, King John.
Or anything like that. But this is where, the public expects its representatives to hold the government to account. And that's the role of the opposition. But what happened here is that everybody realized there was something wrong. Didn't matter if you're Bloc, didn't matter if you were NDP, didn't matter if you were Conservative. Even some Liberals said, this is wrong. You have to come clean, because this is not how you misappropriate hard dollars that the taxpayer has to earn. The person going out and earning and getting their wage whacked and having to pay taxes, as CRA is going to demand, says, I'll do that. But you damn well be accountable for every penny you have. And we are not that. In this case, it really made us look like a banana republic, third world nation.
Yeah. So to be clear, these are honorable institutions, but they've not been acted on honorably and
No.
run in a way that's transparent and accountable. And frankly, it's not in our tradition and it's outrageous. So this is very important information that Canadians need to know about. And on that note, I guess my question is why haven't the legacy media talked about this much? It seems like the silence is deafening.
Yeah, I think the way to look at legacy media is that some of their ability to speak on these things, if they could, has been precluded by the fact that they do accept money from the government. And that is a real problem. It's a conflict. I know
Yeah.
these medias cannot survive without help because of the way in which media has changed, but it does suggest that they can't stay on these issues forever. There's just so much coming down. I think in the case of this particular government, this Liberal government since 2015, there's been so much to go on and so much to go after that you have this this deluge of bad news and what looks like jiggery pokery going
Yeah.
on that it would take tons of media to look at these over the days. What's going to happen is going to take 3 or 4 years after this election to settle it all out. But I can guarantee you this: that says something about the electorate in Canada. Because as a Liberal of 18 years, I'm ashamed of saying that this is the Liberal Party. It's not the Liberal Party,
No.
and the behavior of these individuals is beyond partisan consideration. It's absolutely immoral. It's corrupt. It's not the Canadian way. And each one of them should hang their head in shame and resign. They should be running the next election and wait for the RCMP to make the calls.
Okay, so these are very serious points that beg questions around accountability and transparency. And, we challenge obviously every Canadian to look objectively at the policy issues at here and to make good decisions and choices. So within this context, Dan, we've got a lot of challenges as we deal with a new administration in the United States, as we've talked about. And I guess one of the things that strikes me is that the United States is going through a restructuring as they have a massive deficit and debt, not obviously on a much larger scale than our own, but it's the kind of the similar issues where we have state spending at a level that is stratospheric and truly a threat to our well-being. I think we can all agree on that. Money does not grow on trees. Um, but it seems like so many of our politicians seem to buy into that philosophy. And as they restructure in the United States, I mean, they're working hard through that DOGE effort, the Department of Governmental Efficiency with Elon Musk. I think they're coming up to an effort to save some $1 trillion worth of money here. And I've heard that one of the policies that's being advocated, Dan, is to get rid of income taxes for anyone earning up to $150,000, getting rid of capital gains or reconfiguring it at a very low level, and a lot of other regulatory changes that make it even easier for business to thrive. Are you concerned that Canada is truly going to be a very uncompetitive situation? I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of governments in Canada that really are not business friendly. They don't really want to encourage that. I know it sounds hard to believe, but it's true. I mean, if you just listen to people across different businesses and you look at the number of businesses that are leaving Canada, it's a large number. So are you concerned that Canada, if the United States makes those changes, that Canada is not going to be, frankly, competitive?
Yeah. Well, I think Canada's uncompetitive as it stands, and that's because of the proactive willingness to say, "Don't put your money here," or that you're willing to invest in it, and we give you
Yeah,
the imperature of our support. We're going to change our mind, as we saw with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
indeed. Yes.
And so, when you have that kind of uncertainty, when you're committing billions of dollars, you can't go back to your shareholders and risk and say, "Hey, we bought something on a pig and a poke," and at the end of the day, have that completely denied. And this is, of course,
Yes.
that's the direct cost, but the indirect cost is if we continue to make ourselves uncompetitive and that we become a nation that says, "Oh, it's about free dental care, it's about
Mhm.
universal basic income. You don't have to work; you can just sit at home and mooch." Take
Mhm.
welfare, whatever the case may be, you're only going to continue this whole point of concern that I think economists have shared on all sides: the growing dramatic drop in our productivity, labor productivity to GDP. And I think that's a real clear sign that Canadians have become less productive. Investment is not there to
Mhm.
back it up, and that we've scared away the very things that make us innovative. We talk about a great deal about technology will help us on the climate. Well, it's not going to be done here. It sure as hell's not going to be done here because we've taken everybody who wants to put money in here and we said it's a risk to put your money in Canada. Do not trust the government of Canada. And by the way, David, we're on the hook for $34 billion of that Trans Mountain pipeline expansion because the company said, you promised us, you put it in your own writing, the Queen's Imperature, you gave us a bond that this would go ahead, and then you allowed
Yes.
every Tom, Dick, and Harry wacky organization, lawfare nut jobs to come out and to destroy it. What happened? The company said, we're going to sue you. It's the government said, no, we don't have to do that. We'll buy it from you. There'll be no lawsuit. And they didn't cost us $6 billion. The company didn't cost us zero. It cost us $34 billion. So
Wow.
that's $800 per person in this country. Folks, the numbers just keep rolling out as to what this has cost you. We can't afford this kind of stupidity anymore.
Okay, so I know that you don't have a crystal ball, and neither do I, but you surely any rational decision maker in the bowels of the government and just, walking around as any person with common sense would start to think about what is the worst case scenario here, Dan? Like, are we at risk as a nation if we have another continued capital outflow? Like the last 10 years, we've had some $1.3 trillion of money flow out of this country. And we know anecdotally the numbers of entrepreneurs and many other talented people leaving this nation. I mean, at what point do we say our nation is going to start dissolving before our eyes? And I don't want to sound overly dramatic here, but if you have those capital outflows and people, I mean, that's how you build a nation, is you want to be a magnet for capital, a magnet for jobs and opportunity. Instead, we're pushing it all away through policies that don't make any sense. At what point is our nation at risk?
Well, David, up until 2023, this was a concern. National Bank of Canada put out a quiet report, but it said the only thing that we're seeing any improvement in investment in is investment in real estate in Canada. That's the only thing holding up the economy. Everything else is in recession. With real estate now plummeted and down on its knees, your sales down, construction down. There's no one building anything more in Toronto, Montreal.
Yeah.
There's a couple places here and there. We have very little to write home about, and what we do have is only government moneyed things like electric vehicle plants, which are going bankrupt left and right. We have painted ourselves into a corner, believing that governments can solve everything and that governments should be the ones leading the charge on all these changes. That, frankly, we, as my old boss John Kretzing would have said, we did not look before we leapt into an empty pool, and that's exactly what we've done. In order to be trendy and cool, and be in line with our friends in Europe, and rub shoulders with people while swilling back Perrier and eating canapes, we've actually traded the country away. And my little grandson came out and showed me a book that he was very interested in called Jack and the Beanstalk. We gave away the country for beans, for peanuts. And these green peanuts, I think, are now leading us to a real stark conclusion. We haven't got the money to do what we want to do. We've painted ourselves into a very, very dark corner.
Yeah, so it's a sad story. So, we've got, I think, a fair sense of the reality here, Dan. So my question is, how do we start turning this around? How do we get ourselves out of this ugly corner, quite frankly?
Well, we basically have a government come in and say the institutions of this country are going to have to take a can-do approach and do so effectively, quickly. Speed is of the essence, and if they can't do it speedily, then give it to someone else who will, or do it by executive authority. There's very little in the way. If Mark Carney can, through order in council, decide that he wants to get rid of the carbon tax, we sure as hell can do a lot of that without having to preoccupy Parliament, even though it's its fundamental goal. I think we have to send a very strong message that it's a different day because it's 2025, not 2015.
Yes, right.
We've learned from our errors, and that we now need to understand that the Great Reset is in fact getting back to what worked very well for Canada. Emphasize our resources, emphasize our technology, emphasize our brain power, and make affordability a priority in every sector. So if you want to come up with a trendy idea to make prices more expensive for things, buy, go, leave. You've had your 10 years. Okay. You've made a mess of things. It's time for these people and their trendy ideas to go. They've hurt the country. Right. They're not allowed to be economic vandals or political vandals any longer.
All right. So I like the way you're thinking is let's get this country firing on all economic cylinders. Let's teach our kids about unity as Canadians and be proud about that identity. And I think what you've also challenged us today is to think about rebuilding or renewing our institutions, beginning with the House of Commons for transparency and accountability, right, Dan?
Absolutely. It all begins in the next election. Think about this as a first step towards rebuilding the country. The public will make that decision, but once they decide that, yes, it's time for change for the better, and to renew and modernize what we have as our institutions and move away from this divisive environment that we've lived in, well, region versus regions, ideology versus ideology, and get on with the business of putting the country back together by getting it working again. I'm all for that. I think that's where Canadians have to help the next government make that decision. So at the end of the day, we need
Okay.
a change.
Well, I like the way you've outlined these issues today, Dan, in terms of not only providing us frankly, a sober thought in terms of our situation, but frankly, how we turn it around and the role of citizens. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure again.
It's always an honor. David, thanks for having me and looking forward to more and down the road. Let's have fun in the next couple of months.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan.